To the returning audience members tonight, thank you for joining us again. If this is your first Socratic Club event, you've picked a good one, and thank you for coming. If you're joining us on the live stream, thank you for connecting in with us. We hope that this will be an avenue that you can watch our debates more and more in the future, even with better quality. We are the OSU Socratic Club, and we organize debates and dialogues between scholars, pastors, theologians, and professors on topics surrounding the Christian faith and religion as well, and other religions as well, for OSU and the surrounding community. We aim to provide an open forum for the discussion of intellectual questions connected with religion and with Christianity in particular. The club was first founded in 1941 at Oxford University, with C.S. Lewis serving as its first president. The OSU Socratic Club is proud to be in its 15th year, and we hope to continue for many more. I'd also like to let everyone know that debates are not all we do. The Socratic Club also has a book club that reads and discusses various books. We also have a small library in the Talisman Room in the Memorial Union, where you can check out books related to previous debate topics, often by the debaters, written by the debaters themselves. If you'd like to stay up to date with us, you can follow us on social media, particularly Facebook, or sign up for our email list on the table in the lobby. If you have any more questions about the OSU Socratic Club or have interest in joining, feel free to talk to me or another Socratic Club member after the debate, or visit the table in the lobby and pick up the brochure. We also tonight, this is a sensitive topic, and we're quite aware of that. So tonight we have counseling services for anyone who needs or feels that wants counseling. This is if something has triggered you, it's entirely all right to step out for a few moments and take care of yourself. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. And if you do want someone to talk to or just someone to be with, our counselor tonight is Ellen. Ellen's in the back corner. And you can walk around or just tap her on the shoulder, and she'd be happy to help you with anything that is bothering you. Now let's move on to tonight's debate. The goal of tonight's debate is to discuss the topic, abortion, a legal right or moral wrong. Our two very distinguished speakers will each address the issue, presenting opposing views. Tonight's debate will be about 2 hours and will be structured as follows. Each speaker will be given 20 minutes for his or her chosen opening for an opening statement in favor of his or her chosen position. Next, each speaker will be given a 10-minute rebuttal, which will be followed by 25 minutes of discussion, during which the speakers may ask questions of one another. Questions will then be taken from the audience for 20 to 25 minutes, depending on how much time we have and how time is going. That time tends to pass quickly, so I strongly suggest that you write your question down on your phone or on a piece of paper or anything, so that way when you come up to the podium, you know what you want to say and you can say it clearly and concisely. We will try to close by 9. We started a few minutes late, so it might be a little bit longer. And our speakers will be closing us out with 5-minute closing statements from each speaker. Before I introduce our first speaker, I'd like to remind everyone to please silence their cell phones. I'll give you a moment to do so. Thank you. I'd now like to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Nadine Strossen. Dr. Strossen was president of the American Civil Liberties Union from 1991 to 2008. A graduate of Harvard Law School, she was the first woman and youngest person to ever leave the ACLU. A professor at New York Law School, Strossen sits on the Council of Foreign Relations. I'd like everyone to please welcome Dr. Nadine Strossen.
Is that working? Can you hear me? Great. Thank you so much for that cordial introduction. I'm really honored to participate in tonight's program, and I'd like to thank everyone who has worked so hard to organize it, including especially Braden Anderton, Peter Kilgore, and Gary Fernbrin. They worked really long and hard to find a mutually convenient date, and we were very happy to concur on today because it happens to be historically important for tonight's topic. 43 years ago tomorrow, the United States Supreme Court, for the very first time, answered the first question posed by tonight's topic. In the landmark case of Roe versus Wade, the court held that abortion is indeed a legal right. Moreover, despite all the personnel changes on the court and all the opinions of all of the justices on this issue since then, in almost a half century since Roe, the court's answer remains the same today. Indeed, not a single justice has disagreed with the basic holding that a woman does have a legal right to abortion in at least some circumstances, at a minimum when the pregnancy threatens her life or health. Conversely, not a single justice has ever maintained that a fetus has a legal right to be protected from abortion. In other words, not a single justice has ever contended that a fetus is a legal person entitled to independent constitutional rights before the point of live birth. The only disagreements among the justices concern the extent of government power to regulate or limit the woman's abortion right if it chooses to do so. But no justice has ever maintained that government ever has a legal duty to protect the unborn. Moreover, these same basic legal holdings have also been affirmed as a matter of international human rights law by courts all over the world. Notably, Roe was authored by a Republican justice, Harry Blackmun, who had been appointed by a conservative Republican president, Richard Nixon. Also notably, the court's decision was joined by a total of 7 justices, including 5 who were Republicans, appointed by Republican presidents. Even more notably, for tonight's topic, these justices were observant Christians, including Blackmun himself, a devout Methodist, and William Brennan, a devout Catholic, who regularly attended Mass. So they obviously did not see protecting a woman's legal right to choose abortion as inconsistent with their religious or moral beliefs. Indeed, many religious leaders of many faiths have not only supported this legal right, but they have done so expressly for religious and moral reasons. They have maintained that abortion is a moral choice for women, and that in some circumstances it is actually a moral duty. In particular, when carrying the pregnancy to term would threaten the woman's life or health, or when the fetus has such severe health problems that its birth would be followed only by a short life of great suffering. I'd like to quote an open letter that has been signed by 2,400 religious leaders entitled "Abortion as a Moral Decision." The signers represent 40 diverse denominations, including Christians, Jews, Muslims, Hindus, and Buddhists, including the American Baptist Church, Disciples of Christ, Episcopal Church, Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, Presbyterian Church, United Church of Christ, United Methodist Church, and Conservative and Reform Judaism. I'd like to read just the opening passage of their eloquent letter. Millions of people ground their moral commitment to the right to choose abortion in their religious beliefs. While there are strong public health and human rights arguments for supporting the right of women to safe and legal abortion, we stress the religious foundations for affirming abortion as a morally justifiable decision. Most religious denominations affirm a woman's moral right to decide when abortion is morally justified in light of her own circumstances, the teaching of her own denomination, and the dictates of her own conscience, close quote. Indeed, even denominations that officially oppose abortion also include theologians and devout believers with different views. For example, it's widely known that the Vatican hierarchy is now anti-abortion. What is less widely known is how contested this view has been among Catholic theologians and church members. These divergent views among Catholics were summarized as follows by the organization Catholics for Choice. Quote, "Church teachings and core Catholic tenets, including the primacy of individual conscience and the role of the faithful in defining norms, leave room for a more liberal position on abortion. The Vatican has acknowledged that it does not know when the fetus becomes a person, and it has never declared its position on abortion to be infallible. Therefore, Catholics can, in good conscience, affirm that abortion can be a moral choice. Indeed, many of us do." So let me sum up what I've covered so far. First, abortion is indisputably a legal right, as has been acknowledged by every single one of the many ideologically diverse Supreme Court justices who have ruled on the issue. Second, abortion is also morally right for many women, given their moral and religious beliefs and their specific circumstances. Of course, many people, including Mike, consider abortion to be morally wrong, at least in some circumstances. But it is precisely because we individuals have such differing views on this profoundly personal moral issue that the Supreme Court's legal answer is exactly right. No law, no government official should have the power to bar any woman from making this extraordinarily important decision consistent with her own moral and religious views. In other words, government officials should not be able to impose their religious or moral views on any of us. That is exactly what the First Amendment protects us against by guaranteeing freedom of religion and belief. As the Supreme Court well summed up these essential freedoms, our personal moral and religious views are too precious to be either prescribed or proscribed by government. The Supreme Court also well explained these key freedoms in another landmark abortion ruling in 1992, Planned Parenthood versus Casey. Casey reaffirmed what it called Roe's core holding, namely that women have a right to abortion before the point of fetal viability, that is, when the fetus can survive outside the woman's womb. Notably, the Casey opinion was jointly written by 3 Republican justices who had all been appointed by conservative Republican presidents Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush. As these justices declared, our individual principles of morality cannot control our judicial decisions. Our obligation as judges is to define the liberty of all, not to mandate our own moral code. Moreover, these justices stressed, even if some moral views are shared by the majority of the community, the majority may not use the power of the state to enforce these views on the whole society. After all, suppose the majority of the community shared the moral view that is held by some religions, including some branches of Judaism, that a woman has a moral duty to abort a fetus with severe health problems. Government should not be able to impose that moral view or any other on any woman who did not share it. Now, before I say any more directly about the pros and cons of tonight's proposition, I want to stress one aspect of this discussion on which Mike and I strongly agree with each other, even though many people on many campuses disagree with both of us, and that is that this kind of debate is vitally important. On too many campuses, as well as other places, there have been efforts to shut down debates and discussion about abortion on the ground that anti-abortion or pro-life views are offensive or upsetting to those who disagree with them. Sadly, some of these misguided censorship efforts have succeeded, Worse yet, some of them have violated not only free speech rights, but also gender equality, because they have enforced the position that no man should be allowed to publicly discuss this issue, especially when he takes an anti-abortion stance, as Mike does. I'd like to cite one prominent example involving a very prestigious university, in fact, the university where the Socratic Club was originally founded in the 1940s, Oxford in England. About a year ago, a group of self-styled feminist students forced the cancellation of a debate about abortion that had been scheduled at Oxford between two men, one pro-life and one pro-choice. And by the way, I realize that those terms are contested, but I'm respecting each group's freedom of choice to label itself. Now, at Oxford, one of the successful student censors bragged, "I helped shut down an abortion debate between two men because my uterus is not up for their discussion." Oxford said that it canceled the debate to protect students' mental security, which it defined as avoiding unnecessary distress, particularly for any students who might have had an abortion. Now, wearing both of my hats as a professor and as a civil liberties advocate, I could not disagree more. My concept of providing mental security for my students and for all of you students is to equip you to surmount any distress or any other negative emotion so that you can not only listen to but hopefully participate in any discussion about any important issue, certainly including abortion. And moreover, I believe that all members of our community have at least the right, if not the civic duty, to weigh in on all issues, regardless of such demographic factors as our gender or whether or not we've had an abortion. Now, I don't want to pick only on England because, as Mike knows, we've had these censorship issues in the United States. To cite just one example, which has been captured on YouTube, it was at the UC Santa Barbara about a year ago. A professor actually assaulted a 16-year-old girl who was peacefully holding a sign with an image of an aborted fetus in a designated free speech zone, no less. The professor seized the sign and physically fought the girl when she tried to get it back. The professor claimed that she had a moral right to do this because she felt triggered by seeing the sign. And worse yet, the university came close to blaming the victim, that is the pro-life demonstrators. The chancellor exhorted students, if you feel you are being subjected to offensive speech or material, contact the Office of Student Life immediately. Well, that directive squarely violates what the Supreme Court has called the bedrock principle of our free speech system, that government may never suppress speech merely because anyone considers its message offensive or upsetting, even the vast majority of our fellow citizens. Unfortunately, that principle is being violated on campuses all over the country, so I want to especially thank OSU and the Socratic Club for honoring the spirit of freedom of speech, including on this controverted issue. And I hope you understand that the reason why I strongly defend freedom of speech about abortion and any other topic is the very same reason why I strongly defend reproductive freedom substantively. In both contexts, we individuals have the right to make our own choices about what ideas and beliefs we accept and reject. Likewise, the government should not be able to impose its ideas and beliefs or those of our fellow citizens on us. So now I've laid out my basic case for abortion as a legal right that is also morally right for many women and for many religious leaders in many situations. In my remaining time, and I'd love to see how much time I have, thank you so much. In my remaining time, I'm going to briefly list a few more specific points in support of these conclusions. And I'll have to elaborate perhaps in rebuttal or in response to questions because I don't have much time left. So a few additional points supporting my conclusion. First, the Supreme Court's rulings have reflected a Solomonic, moderate position, respecting both the woman's right to choose and the government's interest in protecting the potential new life in her womb. Because the Supreme Court has allowed government even to outlaw abortion at the point of viability when the fetus can survive outside her womb. That is always with an exception to preserve the life or health of the woman. Second, this crucial line that the court has drawn at viability is consistent with many moral and religious beliefs, including Judeo-Christian beliefs, as has been attested by many religious leaders. Third, the pro-choice position has fairly been described as pro-life, including by many religious leaders, both because it literally saves the lives of all the women who would die through the unsafe, illegal abortions they would have anyway, even if abortion were outlawed, and also because it promotes the lives of the children and families the women already have. Fourth, doctors perform abortions because of their conscientious conviction that they have a moral duty to do so, consistent with their view of the sanctity of life. Fifth, as the Supreme Court has recognized, the constitutional right to abortion reflects principles of gender equality and women's rights, even beyond the general individual rights to bodily integrity and self-determination that we all share. Could I see how much time I have left? 3 minutes. Okay, so I have time to elaborate on a couple of these points, and I'm going to start with the Solomonic line that the Supreme Court has drawn at the point of viability. When Roe versus Wade was argued before the Supreme Court, you had one side, government, the state of Texas, arguing that abortion should always be illegal in every single circumstance except only when absolutely necessary, literally to save the woman's life. On the other hand, Jane Roe and some so-called friends of the court who were supporting her argued exactly the opposite extreme position, that a woman should absolutely have a complete and unqualified right to terminate a pregnancy until the minute of live birth, for any reason or for no reason. And I think the Supreme Court was exactly right to reject both of those extreme positions, to take into account both the woman's interest in autonomy and equality and gender equality and bodily integrity, and also to recognize that regardless of the failure of science or religion or theology or philosophy to agree on this question of when life begins, I think the Supreme Court was brilliantly wise in saying, no matter what, it is at least potential life from the beginning. It is at least a potential person from the beginning, and therefore we have to take that into account. And the way the court took it into account, and continues to do so, is to say, at the point of viability, whenever that may occur, and science is pushing it, medical technology is pushing it earlier in the pregnancy, at that point, the state may regulate and even bar abortion except when necessary to save the life or health of the pregnant woman. So for people who describe Roe versus Wade or other Supreme Court decisions as radically pro-abortion, I could not disagree more. I think it really does a disservice to the care and moderation and fairness of the Supreme Court decision. And now I'm probably almost at the end of my time, so I will come to a conclusion, knowing that I'm engaging in self-censorship. I have many more ideas I would love to share with you, but I would like to close with a statement by the Supreme Court, which has been repeatedly reaffirmed by justices all across the political spectrum, and which eloquently explains why the Constitution protects women's reproductive freedom, not only because it is consistent with her physical autonomy and well-being, but also because it is consistent with her moral autonomy and the religious and conscientious freedom of all individuals, which is valued not only by our Constitution, but by all major religious faiths. As the court declared, these matters involving the most intimate and personal choices a person may make in a lifetime, choices central to personal dignity and autonomy, are also central to constitutionally protected liberty. At the heart of liberty is the right to define one's own concept of existence, of meaning, of the universe, and of the mystery of human life. Thank you very much.
I have to stop here and say, before we keep going, here at the Socratic Club, free speech is very important to us. We really don't like censorship. So that means, Nadine, you can't even censor yourself. You must come back up and take all of your time. So thank you very much for a good opening statement, Nadine. And I'd now like to introduce Dr. Mike Adams. Dr. Adams holds a PhD in sociology and criminology from Mississippi State University. He teaches at University of North Carolina-Wilmington, where he is actively involved in legal challenges to campus censorship, ironically. He is a prolific columnist and participates in Summit Ministries. Please give a warm welcome to Dr. Mike Adams.
Thank you, Nadine. Thank you, everyone, for showing up here this evening. First of all, I definitely want to thank Nadine for her hearty endorsement of freedom of speech. But I have bad news for you. There will be no free speech this evening because Nadine and I will be sending a bill to the university for our efforts tonight. Just kidding. Not kidding, actually. Absolutely want to start by really thanking you for all of your efforts, and Peter Kilgore and all of those in the Socratic Club who put forth all the effort to put together this event. I thank you so much for that. And I want to just basically try to get down to the central question in the abortion debate immediately, because I do not believe it is possible for us to answer the question of what we do with the unborn unless we have answered the predicate question of what is the unborn. And in an effort to get down to that central predicate question in our debate, I want to rely upon a hypothetical, which is absolutely brilliant because I didn't think of it. It was actually thought of by a good friend of mine by the name of Greg Koppel. And join me in imagining this. Imagine that it's a few years in the future, and each and every single one of you have met the man or woman of your dreams. You're married, you have children, you're at home, and you've just fixed a nice meal. And afterwards you're cleaning up, and you're standing there at the kitchen sink when all of a sudden your 5-year-old child comes up behind you and asks, "Mommy or Daddy, can I kill this?" Hopefully there would not be a single one of you who would answer that question without first turning around to see exactly what the child has got. If you were to turn around and to see that the 5-year-old child is holding a cockroach, in my opinion, I would say, go ahead and kill that sucker, flush it down the toilet, wash your hands carefully before your midnight snack, and don't let your mother see it. If, however, I were to turn around and to see that my 5-year-old son had his 2-year-old brother in a headlock and was saying, "Mommy or Daddy, can I kill this?" it would compel a very different answer. Before we answer the question of what we are going to do with the unborn, we have to answer the predicate question, what is the unborn? And what I intend to do this evening is to provide a very clear answer to that predicate question. And I'm going to be basically arguing a twofold thesis. The first part of it comes from science. I'm here to argue that the science of embryology is absolutely conclusive on the scientific issue that the unborn is a distinct, living, and whole human being actively involved in the process of developing itself from within, from the earliest stages of development, namely from conception. And then secondly, I'm going to be arguing from the aspect of philosophy, that there is no difference, no essential difference between the adults that you are today and the unborn children you once were that would have justified killing you at that earlier stage of development. And in order to explore that further, what we're going to be doing this evening, the first thing I'm going to do is actually to show a film. And the film is only about 55 seconds long. And I will warn you in advance that it does indeed show the aftermath of abortion. It shows the aftermath of an abortion performed after 7 weeks, after 10 weeks, and after 24 weeks. But it is set up in such a way that it is not narrated, there is music in the background, so that if any of you have had a bad experience with abortion, if you've had an abortion, if you've funded an abortion, if you have pressured someone into having an abortion and that doesn't quite sit well with you, then you are able to avert your gaze, and it will just take approximately 1 minute, and I will resume my remarks after that. If you can go ahead and roll the clip, please. Thank you so much. There are so many people I know who actually will watch that film and they are convinced that the most persuasive of those images is the aftermath of an abortion after 24 weeks. And I actually disagree with that. I believe that the most persuasive of those images is the picture of the aftermath of abortion after 7 weeks. And the reason why I say that is because doctors, generally speaking, will not perform an abortion until approximately 7 weeks after conception. And as we take a look at that first image, we are actually seeing the earliest stages at which an abortion takes place. And we are able to look at those images, and you were able to see 2 severed hands. And because the skin was translucent, you were able to actually count 10 fingers by looking through the skin. And that is extremely important because I am convinced, and in my experience, the vast majority of pro-choice arguments make no effort whatsoever to answer that predicate question of what is the unborn. They simply assume that the unborn is not human. Let me give you an example. You often hear the argument, it's my body, my choice. However, when we become familiar with the science of embryology, when we become familiar with ultrasound technology, when we look at pictures of the aftermath of abortion, it allows us to raise some very interesting questions. If we are only dealing with one body, is it the truth that a pregnant woman has 4 hands and 20 fingers? The basic scientific facts the assertion that the unborn is not human. However, once we have established that the unborn is human, our work isn't done yet. We still have to deal with the question of whether the unborn is in fact valuable, whether the unborn is in fact one of us. And in order for us to do this, we have to shift away from science and into philosophy. And I've noticed it's actually a minority of the arguments that I hear that actually take this philosophic approach after acknowledging that the unborn is in fact human. And fortunately, when I hear these arguments, I don't hear a million different arguments. I only hear a few different arguments over and over again. And fortunately, a few years ago, an author by the name of Stephen Schwartz wrote a book in which he laid out a thing called the SLED acronym, which helps us to categorize the different arguments that suggest that there's some essential difference between the adult you are today and the unborn child you once were that would have justified killing you at that earlier stage of development. And they're represented by what has come to be known as the SLED acronym. The S in the SLED acronym stands for size. The L stands for level of development, the E stands for environment, and the D stands for degree of dependency. And what I want to demonstrate is that each and every single one of these is they constitute accidental characteristics, which are in fact irrelevant to our worth as human beings. And they put us in a position where if we accept them, we have made a choice in favor of abortion and against human equality. Let me illustrate. First of all, size. If we were to suggest that size, that our value as human beings varies as a function of our size, that would set up the conditions of radical gender inequality. Everyone knows that men are on average taller and weigh more than women, but that does not lead us to conclude that they are therefore more valuable as human beings. If we accept size, we create conditions of inequality. It's the same thing with level of development. I want you to imagine a thought experiment where I'm tutoring a young woman after school. She's 8 years old and she comes from an impoverished background. She doesn't have a fully developed reproductive system yet at 8, and she, in addition to that, does not know how to read or write. She's very much behind in her schoolwork. I'm tutoring her, and I become frustrated by her lack of progress. I take out a gun and I kill her. Fortunately, I am arrested and haled into a court of law. I make an appearance in front of the judge, and at the arraignment, he says, "How do you plead to these charges of murder in the first degree?" And I respond by saying, "Your Honor, I'm not guilty of murder in the first degree. Maybe I'm guilty of murder in the second degree, or perhaps it's just manslaughter, or perhaps it's no offense at all. Your Honor, she's not one of us because she is not as developed as the rest of us." We can all see that that is a flawed way of evaluating the worth of a human being. In addition to that, our environment doesn't determine our value as human beings. I saw a fantastic video the other day, and I usually can't stand these surgical procedures that you see on the Discovery Channel and all that, but I actually saw a video that was absolutely fascinating. A child had a genetic defect, and a doctor actually removed that child. An unborn child was actually removed from the womb of its mother, and the doctor performed a surgical procedure on that child, and after he fixed the defect, he placed the child back in the womb. Are we to stand here and seriously make the argument that that was a non-human or a non-person while it was inside of the womb, and suddenly became human or fully a person when it was outside of the womb, and then when placed back inside was non-human or a non-person again? You see, when we assign these accidental characteristics to determine people's value, we create an episodic problem, which means that people are simply popping in and out of existence. Look, I just moved 3 feet, and I moved back. Did that fundamentally change the kind of thing that I am? Of course it didn't. And then finally, degree of dependency. I want you to imagine a final thought experiment. I'm in a gang. I know it's hard to believe, but I'm in a gang. And I've been dissed by a rival gang member. And I'm going to be driving by his house, and I'm going to exact revenge by taking my AK-47, some of you believe that part, and firing shots into his bedroom window. But I accidentally fire shots into the wrong window, and I kill his twin sisters. How many degrees of homicide have I committed? Well, let me finish the hypothetical. They're Siamese twins. Would anyone seriously make the argument that I've only committed one count of homicide? Well, no, you couldn't if it's degree of dependency. If it's degree of dependency, I have committed no homicide whatsoever because they were connected to one another and they depended upon one another for survival. As we can see, all of these different factors are irrelevant to our worth as human beings. And if we accept them, they set up conditions of savage inequality so that at the end of the day, we have a choice between abortion and human equality. Let me repeat my thesis. I am here to argue this evening that the science of embryology establishes with an absolute consensus that the unborn is a distinct, living, and whole human being actively involved in the process of developing itself from within, from the very earliest stages of development. And there is no essential difference between the adult you are today and the unborn child you once were, which would have morally justified killing you at that earlier stage of development. Ladies and gentlemen, the problem is people just don't really understand how we develop as human beings. And I'd like to illustrate it and try to help us wrap our minds around it with one final thought experiment. But this one's not a hypothetical. This is actually a real situation. In the year 1973, the year that Roe versus Wade was decided, I made my first trip to the Grand Canyon. I love that hole in the ground. It's absolutely beautiful. I've been back many times since then. But that was my very first trip to the Grand Canyon. And I stood there on the south rim of the Grand Canyon at my very favorite overlook, which is Grand Viewpoint. And I stood there holding, I was 8 years old at the time, and I stood there holding a Polaroid camera. And I took a picture, and I pulled that picture out. And my brother, who was 6 years older than I am, came walking over there, and we stood there together at the south rim of the Grand Canyon, and we just stood there and watched that picture develop from something that was very simple and small to something that was becoming larger and obviously increasingly complex. Had my brother reached over and grabbed a hold of that picture and ripped it in two and thrown it over the south rim of the Grand Canyon, I would have been justifiably angry at him for doing so, because the thing was already there, actively involved in the process of developing itself from within. Ladies and gentlemen, we may come here. We may have differences, as Nadine pointed out, on religious perspective. We may have differences on social issues, on political candidates, but we actually share a couple of things in common. One of the things we share in common is our basic human nature. And it's something we've all had that gives us value ever since we came to be. The other thing that we share in common is that we are here this evening still actively involved in our development. Clearly here because we're curious. We're answering great intellectual questions, actively involved in our intellectual development. And we are all here because no one ripped us up and threw us away at an earlier stage of development. Ladies and gentlemen, I am here to argue that morally, in the name of human equality, we have a corresponding obligation to the unborn. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Adams. We're now going to move into the rebuttal section, for which each speaker has 10 minutes. Nadine, you're up.
Thank you very much. Oops, sorry. Thank you very much, Mike, for sharing your passionate commitment and eloquent exposition of your moral beliefs. Obviously, I completely defend your right to make those choices on your behalf and to try to persuade other people to accept them. You do not, however, speak with authority on issues of science or morality or ethics. There is rampant disagreement on all of those fronts. So let's start with science. I was bemused that Mike said that it is absolutely conclusive as a matter of science that human life or personhood begins at the point of conception. First of all, scientists don't even agree what the point of conception is. Let me cite just a few scientific sources here. One is a brief that was submitted in a recent Supreme Court abortion case by, as you probably know, there's something called Friend of the Court, where parties who are not involved directly in the dispute but feel that they have some information or perspectives that can be helpful to the court deciding a major issue are allowed to submit briefs. And this one was submitted by 167 distinguished scientists and physicians, including 11 Nobel laureates, joining in supporting the constitutional right to abortion. Among other things, they said, there is no scientific consensus that a human life begins at conception, at a given stage in fetal development, or at birth. The question of when a human life begins cannot be answered by reference to scientific principles. The answer to that question will depend on each individual's social, religious, philosophical, ethical, and moral beliefs and values. Another scientific source, the U.S. National Academy of Science, stated that the existence of human life at conception is a question to which science can provide no answer. Close quote. And the third source I'll cite, since Mike referenced embryology, is a respected embryology text, Bioethics of the New Embryology by Scott Gibert, Anna Tyler, and Emily Zacklin. Science does not offer a hard and fast answer to the question of when human life begins, and there is no consensus among scientists' opinions. So this is a matter of opinion, belief, a religious belief, a moral belief, a scientific belief, a philosophical belief. The next point that I'd like to make has to do with the film that Mike showed, and I noticed that the disturbing image at the end showed a fetus 24 weeks from fertilization, according to the caption. And I have to note that it is completely legal, consistent with the Supreme Court's rulings, to completely outlaw abortion at that stage, except when necessary to preserve the life or health of the pregnant woman. I mentioned in my opening remarks that as the Supreme Court has recognized that the interest in protecting potential life and potential personhood becomes greater the further you move along in that process, and with a significant breakthrough at the point of viability when the fetus can survive outside the mother's womb. That is an analysis that has been shared by many religious and ethical leaders as well. I'd like to quote Rick Lowry, who is a Bible scholar and Disciples of Christ minister. He said, the moral reasoning of Roe and subsequent Supreme Court decisions reflects what many of us actually think. The moral status of the fetus changes over the course of the pregnancy. The moral view that underlies Roe versus Wade, that a line is crossed when a fetus becomes viable, seems most morally defensible and consistent with the spirit of the biblical view. And he cites some Bible verses, but I think I'm running out. How much time do I have? 5 minutes? Oh, fabulous. Okay, great. So, for example, and again, looking at intuition as well as the Bible and as well as science and law, they all come together. He says, if something goes wrong late in the pregnancy and the fetus dies, we call it stillbirth and issue a death certificate. If the pregnancy ends early on, we call it miscarriage. It's a terrible loss, but most of us think of it differently than we think of a stillbirth. We don't require death certificates for miscarriages. The next point I'd like to make about the film is that, of course, it doesn't show the fully born human being who is involved in this process, in this situation, in an extraordinary, unique, and intimate way. And that is the woman, and most women who have abortions already are mothers, more than 60%. So there are born children who are involved, as well as other family members, all of whom are affected by sometimes agonizing decisions to end pregnancies. Every single woman who ends a pregnancy has a specific, gripping story for doing so. Interestingly enough, in the case that the Supreme Court is about to hear from Texas, in March, something unusual happened. For the very first time, one of the friend of court briefs, in fact, 3 friend of court briefs were submitted by groups of women who had abortions, including very prominent women, including judges, including religious leaders, and they explained in individual detail the harrowing circumstances, including anomalies with the fetus that would condemn it to a tortured and inevitably short existence that propelled them, despite earnestly wanting the pregnancy, that compelled them to make a choice in favor of abortion. So I think it is really disrespectful not to talk about their circumstances, including their reverence for life and making a conscious decision about the potential experience of life of the particular fetus, not to mention their living children. And in that spirit, I'd like to quote a letter from somebody who actually does perform the extremely rare late-term abortions, despite having been raised as a Catholic, and despite for, as he says, the first dozen years of his medical practice because of his upbringing and his religious belief against abortion, he was persuaded by the tragedy of the situations that he saw were propelling women in that direction to make a choice to help them, consistent with his view of reverence for life. He says, the lives, I'm sorry, I should give you his name is Willie Parker, MD. The lives of these women and their families are what compelled me to add abortion care to my practice mid-career, when I was no longer able to weigh the life of a pre-viable or lethally flawed viable fetus equally with the life of the woman sitting before me. He was empowered that healthcare providers should be empowered to include abortion in our practice, second trimester abortions included, because of the women who, in the absence of these services, would die unnecessarily. I should mention that that's another major reason for having these very rare but tragic late-term abortions, is that the woman's life for the first time due to medical tests that can only be performed at that stage of pregnancy, she will be condemned to death if she cannot have an abortion. He said, I grappled with the morality of providing them as I came from a traditional religious background that considered abortion to be wrong. And then, interestingly enough, because we celebrated Martin Luther King Day earlier this week, he said it was listening to a sermon by Dr. King, somebody that most of us consider a paragon of morality and religion and justice and human rights and respect for life. And he talks about how Dr. King related the story of the Good Samaritan to encourage compassionate action on behalf of others. What made the Good Samaritan good, Dr. King explained, was his refusal to place himself first, asking instead, what will happen to this other person if I don't stop to help him? Similarly, I asked the simple question of myself, what happens to women who seek abortion if I don't serve them? This radicalized me, leaving me more concerned about the unnecessary peril to women when safe abortion services are not available than about what would happen to me if I helped women in this way. My time is up, so I'll just say, we know from countries around the world where abortion is still illegal, we know from the United States before Roe versus Wade 43 years ago, tomorrow, that it's not a matter of if women will have abortions or not, it's a matter of whether they will die, be butchered, and be rendered infertile when they have them or not. Thank you.
I didn't know if I was just supposed to charge the stage or be invited back up, so, okay, so I charged. As I was listening to Nadine's remarks, it occurred to me that there are probably about 12 different points of disagreement where I was listening to things and thinking, well, I disagree with that. But I would like to focus upon 3 points of disagreement that I think are major, because I think that there are 3 substantial flaws in Nadine's argument. I think that decimate the argument. I think they're just fatal to the argument altogether. First of all is the problem of agnosticism. Nadine has claimed to be agnostic on the question of when life begins. That's an excellent reason not to kill the unborn if you don't know if you're killing a human being. But let me tell you something, it is absolutely not a position that can be sustained by the science. The Supreme Court said in Roe versus Wade that the question of a woman's fundamental right to choose is inextricably bound to the question of when life begins. If that is true, if you claim agnosticism on the question of when life begins, then you don't know the parameters of the right that you are defending. So agnosticism is a problem for that reason. But additionally, there is a scientific consensus on the question of when life begins. And I'll try and explain the 2 ways that Nadine attempted to divert our attention away from that consensus. But first of all, let me make my point. Moore and Persaud write, a zygote is the beginning of a new human being. Human beings develop at fertilization, the process during which a male sperm unites with a female egg to form a single cell called a zygote. This highly specialized totipotent cell marks the beginning of each one of us as a unique individual. I have definition after definition after definition from science of embryology textbooks which comport with that. But I also have an interesting statement here from Alan Guttmacher, who was the former president of Planned Parenthood. Writing a book in 1933, he says, this all seems so simple and evident that it's difficult to picture a time when it wasn't a part of the common knowledge that life begins at conception. During the Civil War, Dr. Horatio Storer, the American Medical Association's Committee on Criminal Abortion, the president of that committee said, physicians have now arrived at the unanimous opinion that the fetus in utero is alive from the very moment of conception. That was in the 1860s. Peter Singer, who is one of the most prominent pro-choice advocates in America, says there is no doubt that from the beginning moments of its existence, an embryo conceived from human sperm and eggs is a human being. And Warren Hearn, who performs abortions, said we have reached a point in this particular technology where there is no possibility of denial that it is an act of destruction by the operator. It's before one's eyes. The sensations of dismemberment flow through the forceps like an electric current. There is a consensus on when life begins, because dead things don't grow, ladies and gentlemen. There is a consensus. But where are these diversions coming from? First of all, when Nadine talks about briefs that have been submitted to the United States Supreme Court, it is in fact true that every major medical organization has indeed submitted briefs since Roe versus Wade, but they have submitted them in support of abortion, answering the question of whether or not abortion should be legal without answering the predicate question of when life begins. And when Nadine does a similar thing with religious organizations, she quotes pastors and religious organizations, she is also speaking the truth when she says that many of them have supported a woman's right to choose as a fundamental right, and in some cases an actual moral obligation. But they suffer from the same problem. They're not answering the predicate question of when life begins. If a religious organization were to submit a brief to the Supreme Court saying that they had a right, as a matter of religious obligation or duty, to burn their 5-year-old child on a funeral pyre, we would not recognize that as a legitimate form of religious expression. Why? Because we know that it kills an innocent human being. We can't answer that question of whether it should be legal without answering the predicate question. Nonetheless, I believe that Nadine has arrived at a radical position on the issue of abortion by embracing Roe versus Wade, and I strongly disagree with her on her characterization of Roe versus Wade as a moderate decision. I view it as an extreme decision, and here's the reason why. The United States Supreme Court in Roe versus Wade did in fact say that during the 3rd trimester, the state has an interest in preventing an abortion from taking place. However, they said that that was subject to a health exception. And the same day in Doe versus Bolton, they defined the parameters of health by saying that it includes physical, emotional, psychological, familial factors, the woman's age, and any factor relevant to the well-being of the patient. Did you hear that? It means that if a woman who is pregnant with a child in the 3rd trimester would be emotionally or psychologically stressed out by having the child, that is a legitimate health reason to abort that child. And that is the reason why we have had 56 million abortions since Roe versus Wade. Since 1974. 1974 is the only year after Roe where we had less than 1 million. Since then, it has been over 1 million every single year, peaking at 1.6 million in 1990, 1991, and 1992. We only got there because of an extreme decision. Now the question is, has it been worth it? Has it been worth it? Are we really saving other human lives in the process? Would thousands of women be dying as a result of back county abortions if Roe versus Wade hadn't come along? Bernard Nathanson said that when he co-founded NARAL, but later on he converted to Catholicism. And as a Catholic, he confessed that he made the statistic up. So what's the real number? Glad you asked. I've got the answer in my hand. In 1960, Mary Calderon, the National Medical Director of Planned Parenthood, wrote an article based upon a speech she gave in 1959. Abortion is no longer a dangerous procedure. In 1957, there were only 260 deaths in the whole country attributed to abortions of any kind. 90% of all illegal abortions are presently being done by physicians in good standing in their communities. They must do a pretty good job if the death rate is as low as it is. Abortion is no longer dangerous because it is being done well by physicians. That was being said in 1959. Ladies and gentlemen, has it been a good deal? Has it been a good trade-off? We save 260 women per year who would have died as a result of unsafe abortions. We kill over 1 million a year. That's a good trade-off. If what? If those 260 women are human beings and the unborn isn't. However, the science of embryology will not allow us to maintain that fiction. Thank you. No way.
Oh, yes, I need it. I'm so sorry.
I
That was
picked it up in
absolutely
my
wrong.
notes. Sorry, censorship trick here. Would you like, Mike, would you like to?
I stole one of these.
We will now move to the discussion section of tonight's debate, for which we have 25 minutes. The speakers will alternate asking questions of one another, and that will allow for free-form discussion in general. I will usually only step in if I feel one side isn't being able to ask questions enough, if it's becoming imbalanced, something like that. Generally, it'll be pretty free-form. Speakers, please try and be succinct. We only have so much time. I guess, Dr. Adams, do you have a question for Dr. Strossen?
We're on a first-name basis.
I had no idea that we were going to be cross-examining one another, so, okay. I didn't know we were asking questions. But it's a discussion, but they're questions. Okay. I guess one of the points you made in your presentation was to discuss the importance of liability. What is liability? What does it measure? And why is it morally significant?
Thank you so much for asking the question, because a lot of people wrongly think that viability is a fixed point in pregnancy. In fact, it's defined conceptually, and the Supreme Court has reaffirmed that it is the point at which the fetus can survive independent of the woman. And the reason why that's significant, Mike, and if you don't mind, it leads to a question of you, and I welcome the chance to discuss. Is that, as you know, under our law, there is no obligation on the part of one human being to give of his or her body, or parts of his or her body, for the sake of helping a human being, right? I don't have to donate an organ to you. I don't even have to donate an organ to one of my own fully born, let's say 5-year-old children. So the court has understood that to be a legally as well as ethically significant fact, that we are entitled to be independent. Maybe some of us would think it would be a good thing to choose to make that sacrifice of our own bodies, but the government cannot force it upon us. If you don't mind my asking, adding a question, what do you think about that? Do you think that parents should be required to donate organs to kids?
No, right now you're making a transition away from the viability issue actually
Well,
into the
but
issue
see,
of
that's,
bodily
but that's
autonomy.
the logical connection. That because you cannot impose upon a woman providing sustenance, the potential of life to this, whatever you want to call it, fetus, preborn as you would call it, it becomes legally significant when it can survive independent of her. So she's no longer being asked to donate her body in a way that we don't ask her to donate her body, even part of her body, even for a fully born child.
I'd like to actually separate them out though,
Okay.
because I see an enormous flaw with considering viability to be morally significant. You're from New York City. Let's say, hypothetically, this is something else. You have a couple of professors who teach in the area of law, and they can't survive without giving hypotheticals, right? I can't imagine a world without hypotheticals, because that would be another hypothetical. So, I am greatly disturbed by assigning moral significance to viability, because I don't believe that viability is a measure of humanity or personhood. I believe it's a measure of technology. For example...
And the court doesn't disagree with that.
Well, but
that's why I'm saying the
we-
reason doesn't have to do with that. It has to do with the ability to survive independently.
So, from a moral perspective, we have a woman who is in New York City. She's 21 weeks pregnant, and we know in New York, and in some cases, the child can actually survive outside of the womb at 21 weeks. That's a very early point of viability. She decides during the pregnancy that she's going to go on a short-term mission trip with her church, and she goes to China where the point of viability is 28 weeks. She spends a few weeks there and comes back. Is it the case that she was carrying a human being who then became non-human and suddenly became human again? You see, for me, viability isn't a measure of humanity. It's a measure of technology. And where do we go with that? I think that by assigning human beings value based upon what they can do, we set up conditions of inequality.
Yeah, but we're looking at it obviously from two very different
Right.
perspectives, and the perspective. And so let me then ask you about
Right,
the
right.
second point. I mean, given your apparent view that once something is considered human, it has a claim upon another human even to occupy that person's body, I assume you would then say that a parent should have a legal obligation to donate an organ to a child. The law should be compelled.
No,
that
because
parent
in
to do so.
abortion, eyesight is not at stake. Life is at stake.
Okay, but suppose
Right.
it was life-saving, that the child was going to die unless he gets a kidney from his or her parent. Would you then say the parent should have a legal obligation to provide
They have done
that?
a profoundly immoral thing if they allow their child to die.
Okay,
under
and
those
then what
circumstances.
about a stranger? Because that's also a full-fledged human being. Suppose I'm dying unless I get a kidney,
Right.
and you happen to have the right kind. Should you have a legal obligation to me?
No, and here's the problem in your reasoning. You are morally equating the withdrawal of support and active dismemberment. This very much reminds me of the Judith Jarvis Thompson hypothetical. Of course, the famous essay that she wrote. It's been decades, I guess it was
Yeah,
probably during the
yeah.
1970s. And she said, imagine that there's a famous violinist.
Yeah.
And the Society for Music Lovers comes along and decides to kidnap this woman because isn't it a kidney condition or something like that? And because of blood type and for other reasons, she's the only one who can keep that famous violinist alive. And so what they then do is say, we're going to kidnap you and we are going to basically draw off of your body fluids for a period of 9 months. And then after that, you're free to go. And so Judith Jarvis Thompson uses that to make the bodily autonomy argument and to suggest that similarly, a woman is under no moral obligation whatsoever to sustain the life of her child. And I think that it works if the cases are parallel. but the cases aren't parallel by any stretch of the imagination. One factor, obviously, that's different is you're dealing with a stranger in one case, and we all have to recognize that you have a greater moral obligation to your own child than you do to a perfect stranger. But notice what's happening here. You teach in constitutional law and criminal law as well, I believe, and I teach in a criminology department. Notice that you have a violinist here who's obviously a criminal. He's involved in a criminal conspiracy. There's false imprisonment, there's kidnapping, there's aggravated battery that occurs when they inject her with needles and draw her fluids out. And his punishment for engaging in that criminal conspiracy is that he's unhooked. But then notice what Thompson tries to do. She tries to say that justifies the active dismemberment of a child. And notice what's morally different about the child. The child isn't a criminal. The child has engaged in any conspiracy whatsoever. And who bears the brunt in that analogy? So I am often suspect of bodily autonomy arguments that attempt to claim that the right to bodily autonomy is absolute and trumps someone else's life.
Okay, I disagree. I think it again comes back to this notion that we just have different worldviews on about the significance of your concept of humanity. But I'd like to shift gears because I know 25 minutes goes fast. And much as I relish talking about what we disagree about, I'm also really concerned about trying to find common ground, because it seems to me that nobody that I've ever met or read supports affirmatively the idea of having abortions. In other words, supports affirmatively an unwanted pregnancy, an unintended pregnancy, a pregnancy that results in the kinds of conditions that persuade women to have abortions, such as damage to her health, threat to her life, fetal anomalies. So why can we not work together to promote access to full-fledged sex education, sexuality education, access to contraception, including emergency contraception for women who have been raped? Why can we not work together to facilitate parenthood, to take care of kids and families who already exist? Because sadly, a disproportionate number of women who opt for abortion do so because they are too poor to afford another child. And so what do you think about those ideas, Mike?
Well, you've raised a number of issues. First of all, I'm proud of the direction in which the pro-life movement has gone in recent years. I think since the 1990s, there has been a shift in our emphasis, and now we've reached a point in our country where there are 2 crisis pregnancy centers for every abortion clinic in the United States of America, and we're recognizing that it is extremely important for us to understand that women are in tough situations and that they do face very difficult economic circumstances. And if we in fact believe that abortion is a profound moral wrong, we really have a moral obligation to go out there and affirmatively do something to help these women. And that's why I work with crisis pregnancy centers all the time, and I applaud the work that they're doing. But when it comes to the issue of prevention versus illegality, I believe we have a false dichotomy there. I believe that there's no reason why we can't try to stop something like abortion through making it illegal and also working on preventative measures as well.
The reason I ask is because some right-to-life advocates, I have no idea your own position, but some oppose sexuality education,
right,
except abstinence only. Some oppose at least some methods of contraception. Some oppose emergency contraception, and so I'd just like to know your positions on those issues.
Yeah, I support it.
Good.
I do support it, and I also support comprehensive sexuality education if in fact it is not indoctrination, if in fact it really presents useful information. For example, If you want to talk about having comprehensive sex education, why not talk about fetal development as one component of that and let them know what's going inside of the womb? Because one of the things we know at those crisis pregnancy centers from their experiences in great organizations like Save the Storks is that when you take women and show them the ultrasound, that has a big effect on them. The information has a big effect on their decision to abort. So as long as we make that a part of the equation, I'm very happy with that, and as long as it's not about indoctrination. I'm not one of those pro-lifers who supports abstinence-only education because what we're doing here this evening, this discussion that we're having on the issue of abortion, this isn't the main thing I do. As you know, probably, the main thing I do is free speech advocacy. So how can I then say we're only going to approach a complex topic from one perspective? I absolutely disagree with that, but I want to emphasize the point that it's important that we not suggest that we should only be involved in prevention. Look, when we take a look at the issue of spousal abuse, you would think I had lost my mind if I said we should make spousal abuse legal and simply focus on prevention. You know, if men were given psychological counseling, then they wouldn't want to beat their wives. I think most people would recognize you have to do both. And the reason why you recognize that you have to do both is because when that man engages in spousal abuse and beats his wife, he's infringing upon the rights of an innocent human being.
That's, by the way, one of the reasons why that many women give for having abortions is that they were abused by their spouse and denied, and as part of his tyranny over her, he hides the contraception or refuses to use it. But Mike,
I'm sorry, one second, real quick. Let's remember we have limited time, so let's try and be succinct with our questions.
Let's do
Just to try and be a little more succinct.
I thought we just lost
I
thought we lost form
I
altogether.
thought we were having a discussion,
I like this.
which I like.
Sorry.
We
Go ahead.
felt it was a free-form
Just
discussion.
ignore his
That's what we have
speech.
freedom about.
He has a right to speak, but we don't have to listen, do
So
we?
my question is, in terms of crime, so you are treating the preborn from every stage as a human, then presumably abortion is murder. So then, should the woman who has the abortion be prosecuted for homicide?
Definitely not.
Well, why not?
And I'll tell you why. I've got a couple of reasons for that. First of all, it's interesting. You were the head of the ACLU for about 18 years, and so obviously you guys had tremendous concerns about encroachments upon civil liberties as a result of the war on drugs. I know you did a lot of cases involving that, and when I look at the war on drugs, I find it to be absolutely reprehensible that we would go and arrest desperate people, desperate individuals who were seeking out drugs, instead of focusing on the regular supplier. I mean, why would you go for the occasional user when you could go for the regular supplier? If we are to take that and apply it to the abortion debate, who's the regular supplier? It's the abortion doctor. And the abortion doctor knows precisely what he's doing. It is premeditated, willful, intentional, non-provoked killing of an innocent human being. I quoted an abortion doctor. They know precisely what they're doing. They're guilty. If that's a human being, they are guilty of homicide and they should be prosecuted. I don't favor prosecuting the women. If it's human, we have an obligation to protect them.
I assume you would support abortion in the case where it is necessary to save the life of the mother. I understand your views about the health exception, but what about the life exception?
Absolutely. But first of all, we have to get into the question of how we define abortion. If we define abortion as the intentional killing of an unborn human being, then you look at a case like, let's take ectopic pregnancy, where the woman is pregnant and that child is forming outside the womb in the fallopian tube. And if that abortion is not, or if that pregnancy is not terminated, then it's going to kill the child and it's going to kill the mother as well. And so morally, we have to act in such a way as to save one life there. So you look at that, and it really raises a fundamental moral question here. are we removing that ectopic pregnancy with the intention of killing it? Or is it the case that our intention is to save the woman, but we don't intend, but rather foresee that unfortunately the child is going to be killed? So you could make an argument for saying that's really not abortion, but you understand where I land on this. We have an obligation under those circumstances to remove the child. So I recognize the woman, of course. If I'm going to recognize that the child has natural rights and has a right to life, I have to recognize that the woman has a right to self-defense.
So then let me ask you this, Mike, and since you teach both criminal law and constitutional law, I assume you disagree with the Supreme Court not only in the abortion cases, but also in sexual intimacy cases, same-sex intimacy, that the fact that the majority of the community considers it to be immoral should be a justification for making it a crime. So you would support criminalizing homosexual relations?
Oh, no, I don't. I don't.
So
I would get to the same place that you do in a different way. I look at sodomy laws as being unbelievably ridiculous and being unbelievable waste of police resources. And so I just think that the police ought not to be allowed to enter a person's home to do that. But I don't believe you have to get there through a constitutional right to privacy. I think you see this in other areas such as criminal procedure, where the court does things that they think are good and place an appropriate distance between the individual and the government, but they do it through the Constitution sometimes when they don't have to.
Well, since part of our topic is legal, then let me ask you this. Do you think the Supreme Court was wrong to hold that there is a constitutional right to contraception?
Oh, yes. Yes, I don't think there is a constitutional right to privacy, no. No, but I think the law that they struck down, that was in Connecticut in 1965, you're referring to the Griswold case, the law was absolutely ridiculous. And I believe that there's some things that, some questions that we answer in legislatures and not through judicial fiat. Yeah, that's my basic outlook. Well, we arrive in the same place on a lot of those issues. The sodomy laws and contraceptive laws, I think those are both very bad ideas, obviously.
But so, as far as abortion regulation is concerned, if you were universe, you would make it a crime for a doctor to perform an abortion, but you would not make it a crime for a woman to have one. What about the related issue of a woman, and we've had, this is not a hypothetical, I tend to deal with real world situations because any hypothetical you could dream of has been actually enacted in some state, it turns out. So many states have enacted laws animated by pro-life concern that regulate what a pregnant woman may or may not do on the theory that it may endanger the fetus, so that, you know, it's a crime for her to ingest certain substances, including alcohol. It's a crime for her to work in certain jobs where she might be exposed to certain toxic substances. Would you support those kinds of laws out of your concern for the unborn?
I'm interested in your answer to that, your position on that. You've been asking a lot of questions I haven't been asking too many, but what are your thoughts on that?
I think, yes, and there the U.S. Supreme Court has answered those questions consistent with Roe versus Wade and Casey, which is that the woman's interest and autonomy cannot be subordinated to that of the pre-viable fetus. But so I'm just kind of curious as to the implications of your philosophy, what the world would look like from a pregnant woman's point of view, when she is seen as predominantly, as I understand your perspective, Mike, she's predominantly this vehicle for, you know, this incubator for this potential life.
Well, you keep going back to the issue of potential life. You keep using that term, potential life. What is it? At conception, what do you have there? Because you know, what we know scientifically is that at conception, we have separate DNA and we have cell division. Are you really saying that that's a potential life?
Yes.
Or are you saying it's a potential person philosophically?
Both.
Okay, both. Okay. But dead things don't grow. It's growing. It has to be alive,
It's a potential human life, yes.
but it's growing. Dead things don't grow.
Well, cells are alive too, and
Okay.
that doesn't give them rights of personhood.
Well, they're not
The
distinct,
Constitution.
living, and whole human beings, as we learned.
And nor is the conceptus.
Well, but the science of embryology does say that they're distinct, living, and whole human beings. And there is an
Not
overwhelming
the scientific
consensus.
authorities that I've cited, Mike. I'm
Okay.
sorry.
I did hear one quotation that you gave that challenged that from a science of embryology textbook. I have never heard of that textbook before and never seen any embryology textbook which denied that life, in fact, began at conception. But we need to be careful with something. If there is a lack of an absolute consensus, that doesn't mean that there's a lack of truth. I mean, there was, in fact, a time when people disagreed about the shape of the Earth. The Earth still had a shape. There is an answer out there. You would agree.
No, I don't think so. I think that what I take from, and like you, this isn't, I'm not a scientist, so I depend on secondhand, reading those who are. And what I take from it is that there is no concrete answer, that it's a matter of opinion, it's a matter of characterization. Yes, you can characterize it has DNA and how many cells it has, and after a certain amount of time it can survive on its own. But I think it really is, first of all, it's a legal question, because as you've said, and we should tell the audience, the term that's used in the Constitution is person. And not a single Supreme Court justice has ever argued that the fetus is a person. The justices that are considered pro-life are the ones that say if the state chooses to restrict or even prohibit abortion, they may do so. But not a single justice has ever argued that there is an obligation, a legal obligation, to respect the personhood of the fetus. So I guess on the legal issue, I would say there's an absolute consensus the other way, that it is not a person. Even at the point of viability, the court has never said there is an obligation on the part of the states to outlaw post-viability abortions.
I think we're in very dangerous territory when we begin to say that there's a difference between a human being and a person. We've done that before. Every time it's been done throughout the course of human history, it's had disastrous consequences. Best example of that, Dred Scott. I think Roe versus Wade is the modern Dred Scott, because I just don't think there is any essential difference philosophically that doesn't create potentially savage conditions of inequality.
To say the difference between a one-cell organism and a full-fledged human being, a lot of people do really see a difference, including as the religious authorities that I cited. So I have a great respect for your reverence for life, and I'm curious. This is the first time Mike and I have ever met each other. We never even spoken on the phone.
Yeah, we have.
Oh yeah, we spoke on the phone once or twice maybe.
Not very memorable for
Yeah.
her, but
I do remember. You were at your cabin in Colorado, right?
That's right.
So, forgive me. So my question is, and I understand that you can draw distinctions, but just in terms of your reverence for life, do you support the death penalty? Do you support taking life for self-defense? What are the limits, if any, on your reverence for the sanctity for life?
Well,
Dr. Adams, if you could maybe answer this quickly. We're about out of time. I don't know if it can be answered quickly, but
okay.
You're good.
Well, I certainly support the right of self-defense, and that's how I arrive at the conclusion that termination of pregnancy in the case of ectopic pregnancy is necessary. I get to that answer through a fundamental right of self-defense as opposed to a right to privacy. We get to the same place through a different mechanism. I don't have time to address the death penalty, do I? Do I?
30 seconds.
Okay. Let me just say that some people say that it is a double standard when you say that you are pro-life on the issue of abortion but support the death penalty. A double standard is when you apply two different standards to the same thing. A convicted murderer and an unborn child are not the same thing. And I think we can all agree, in the case of the death penalty, certainly wrong to convict an innocent person Can we apply that to abortion? I'm done.
Thank you very much for what was a fantastic dialogue. We are now moving into the audience question and answer period. But you gotta stop before you go to the mics here. I have a few directions I'd like to give you before we jump into the section. First, I'd ask that you make sure you have your question ready and in your head or on your phone or whatever, in order that you can be clear and concise. When you come up to the mic, please address the speaker that you wish to speak to. Socratic Club, two of you guys, can you come and man the mics real quick? And then also, please refrain from giving any kind of statement of, giving a speech or statement of opinion. They should be limited to questions. It's okay to frame your question as well. We have here on the left, this will be for Dr. Adams. And on the right here, my right, your left, will be for Dr. Strossen. You may now line up if you have any questions. Speakers, time is sensitive. We're only going to have 20 minutes of this, so concise answers would be fantastic. First question.
Dr. Strossen, you said, I gathered, a fetus has no right because the judges, the state, the individual don't defend the right. So where do our rights come from?
Excellent question, and I believe your name is Chris, right? No? Yes. I appreciate people who give their names. We were asked, the first part of the topic is there a legal right? And so I was defining it in terms of what the Supreme Court has held in interpreting the Constitution. But I completely agree with your philosophy, Chris, which is that we have inherent human rights by virtue of being born human, and that is reflected in the Declaration of Independence, which talks about God-given rights, and I absolutely believe that, as the Constitution says, in the preamble, we the people do ordain and establish in order to secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, not to give them. We already have them. The purpose of government is to protect, if you're a religious believer, God-given rights, or if you're secular humanist, by virtue of our humanity. I'm not relying on the Supreme Court to bestow rights that I think I deserve. I just will disagree about whether the fetus deserves rights for those independent reasons, but I take your point. It's an excellent one.
Do I answer those two?
I have a question for you. We're the death penalty.
Oh, okay. I was actually opposed to the death. Oh.
That's me.
Oh, okay. I actually was opposed to the death penalty for a long time, and was fairly recently in time changed my mind on that. Actually, interestingly, it was around the time of the case of Kennedy versus Louisiana, when I decided that I think that our jurisprudence in that area is very morally confused. That was the case where a man had repeatedly raped and tortured his 5-year-old stepdaughter for about 3 years, and she barely survived. And subsequently, he was actually sentenced to die by the state of Louisiana. The case eventually reached the Supreme Court on June 30th of 2008, and in a 5-4 decision, the United States Supreme Court decided that it would be excessively cruel and unusual punishment to execute him for that repeated torture and prolonged long-term rape of his stepchild that took place over the course of several years. It would violate evolving standards of decency. And I bring that case up because we're now in a very interesting position where people like to bring up the issue of the rape exception. And people are absolutely morally appalled by the idea that pro-lifers would be opposed to an abortion in the context of rape? Well, think about our jurisprudence and think about where we are in this country right now. In a situation where a woman is raped, the woman has a constitutional right to abortion. The rapist has a constitutional right to life. He can't be executed, and the unborn child has absolutely nothing. So I would submit that for your consideration.
Dr. Strossen, would you like to comment on?
I agree with Mike's distinction conceptually between abortion and the death penalty, but I also think, and apparently he understands, that there are many people who have such a reverence for life that they are willing to forgive even the most heinous crime and to give another chance to that human being, and also to oppose the idea of the government taking life unless it is in self-defense. So I understand the distinction, but I also think there's a very powerful moral argument even to defend the right to life of somebody who has committed heinous crimes. And I understand that to be the position of the Catholic Church among other religions.
And I believe it's a complex issue where both sides have good points.
Question for Dr. Adams?
First of all, my mother was raped, and I'm the product of that, and I have 3 children, so I'm kind of really glad it was illegal back then to abort me. But the question has to do with the cell aspect.
Who's your question for? Is it for Dr.
It's for Dr. Adams, but both of you, I guess, can answer. When a child is conceived, when its 2 cells meet, there's DNA, correct? Is it the DNA of a plant, of a hippopotamus, or of a human? Can we discern that upon the point of when those cells meet?
It's human DNA.
Okay, that's all I needed to know.
Dr. Strossen, would you like to comment? Okay.
Hi, my name's Jerry. Dr. Strossen, you mentioned that a woman shouldn't have to donate or a person shouldn't have to donate a kidney to her child. That's
I think you're holding close to your mouth.
sorry. You were saying that a woman shouldn't have to, a family member shouldn't have to donate a body part to a born child. What of the moral ineptness, I guess, of us people having to pay for abortions through, government-funded Planned Parenthood, and that type of thing?
Okay. So first of all, I wasn't saying that a woman shouldn't. I'm just saying that as a matter of our legal system, there is no legal duty to do it. I agree with Mike. There's an enormous moral force. One would hope that a loving parent would feel impelled to do it as a matter, but it's not a legal duty. Since right after Roe versus Wade, the federal government and state governments have refused to fund abortion even when, for poor people who would otherwise be covered by medical programs benefits programs that would pay for pregnancy and live childbirth expenses. So that was challenged by Planned Parenthood and the ACLU and other pro-choice organizations saying, well, the woman, as a constitutional law matter, has a choice, according to the Supreme Court in Roe versus Wade, whether to carry the pregnancy to term or whether to have an abortion pre-viability. But for poor women, if government is saying, we're going to fund your choice to have the baby, but we're not going to fund your choice to have an abortion, we argued, well, that is putting pressure on the woman. And the Supreme Court rejected that argument. So we weren't happy about the outcome, but you should be. Since then, it has been completely legal for the government to not fund abortion, and in most states, it chooses not to. And that, unfortunately, is one of the reasons why poor women disproportionately either have abortions later in pregnancy or have carry pregnancies to term even when they are unwilling to or would rather not.
Dr. Adams, would you like to comment?
No.
If there are any questions for Dr. Strossen, please don't be shy. Or for Dr. Adams, please don't be shy.
My question is for both. One aspect that the question of the woman's right to have an abortion seems to completely ignore is the right of the father. The unborn child is his just as much as the mother's. Since the pregnancy would not have started without his involvement, do the rights of the father not exist or matter?
Well, I'll answer first as a technical legal matter. The Supreme Court has held that if there is a dispute between the father and the mother, that there's got to be a tiebreaker, right? And that the mother's decision prevails for the reason that she bears, in the most literal sense, the more immediate consequences of carrying the child, carrying the pregnancy. I certainly think that fathers have a extremely important concern, and one would hope that women would discuss candidly and thoroughly and take into account the wishes not only of the father, but there are a lot of other people who are intimately involved. But ultimately, if there is a dispute, I certainly would not want to say, well, the tiebreaker is the father, especially given situations when there can be spousal abuse.
Yeah, I would like to respond to that. Earlier this evening, Nadine quoted what has come to be known as the mystery passage from Planned Parenthood versus Casey. It says, "At the heart of liberty is the ability to define the meaning of life, existence, and the meaning of the universe." If you didn't understand what that meant, let me translate that for you. What it means is that a woman, and only a woman, has a right to define another human being out of existence if that human being gets in their way. And we've done that under the guise of promoting gender equality. Once again, every time we move in the favor of abortion, we undermine equality. And that's just one of the more recent examples.
Well, when you say that a father should have a veto power, well, I guess that's hypothetical,
Yeah.
because you don't think there should be right in the first place.
Question for Dr. Adams.
Well, this is for, sorry, Dr. Strossen. If abortions should not be restricted in the case of mother's health being harmed.
I'm so sorry, could you speak a little more slowly?
Sorry, I talk fast. So if abortions should not be restricted in the case of a mother's health being harmed, regardless of the status of the preborn, shouldn't we then be able to put down babies and toddlers because they are also hard on a mother's health, like a psychology, career down? And if that's not the case, then isn't it really the primary concern really the human nature of the preborn? Why wouldn't this also apply to babies and toddlers if they don't have the same effect on mothers?
I'm so sorry, because I do draw a distinction between a living, breathing, born human being and something that is not.
So the question is on periphery.
Sir, we don't have time for all questions. I'm sorry.
I think that's the fundamental disagreement between us, and we could just keep repeating it.
I want to add that Peter Singer is obviously one of the most famous and controversial ethicists from Princeton University, and he has become somewhat infamous because he not only supports a right to choose abortion for whatever reason throughout all 9 months of pregnancy, but he also supports the right to infanticide in the first 30 days after birth. How did he arrive at that conclusion? Well, first of all, he's honest on the issue of what is the unborn. He recognizes that they're in fact humans, and he argues that there is no essential difference in functionality between the unborn and the recently born. He is intellectually honest, and that really shows you the danger of essentially adopting gradualist positions. on what makes human beings valuable, and that is one of the overriding points that I'm trying to establish this evening. There is no moral distinction between the two, and this is the dangerous zone that we get in when we say that human beings don't have value by nature of what they are, but instead have value by nature of what they can do.
Do either of you have a question for Dr. Adams? Okay, fantastic.
Dr. Strossen had quotes that included Muslims and others in the Catholic Church, and I guess I would like to know your opinion on the correctness of using those sources when we're talking about a legal right or a lex prudence that is based upon U.S. Constitution as opposed to Sharia law or the Catholic Church in another country, as well as other positions.
Sure, I can answer that, and I can say that all of those organizations, religious organizations, who have expressed a view in favor of a woman's right to choose abortion, who have submitted briefs to the United States Supreme Court over the course of the last half century or so, I believe that they all have a right to do that. They all have a right to weigh into the discussion. However, I don't think that they are qualified to answer the question of when life begins. When we say that you have a free speech right, we aren't necessarily saying that you know what you're talking about. And that's the reason why I look past the views of those religious organizations and focus on the mass consensus in the science of embryology.
And the reason why I raised those, not at all being a moral philosopher myself, is that we have a two-part question, which I think is appropriate. Not only is there a legal right, but is it morally right or wrong? So I was addressing both parts of the issue.
We'll take these last two questions.
Okay. My question is actually for Dr. Adams, but may apply to both. The discussion on abortion rights has and will continue to turn on whether or not a fetus is a person or a human being. Neither of you mentioned those sentience or self-awareness. So I'm wondering, Dr. Adams, you mentioned that dead things do not grow, but then how can you explain how vegetarians will eat plants which grow but will refuse to eat animals? And doesn't self-awareness matter to define what life is in terms of personhood?
Okay, there are a lot of questions thrown in there, and I'm going to address actually the one that I think is the most important, and that is the idea of consciousness, and whether self-awareness or consciousness is the thing that gives us our rights. Let's just say, heaven forbid, that on the way home this evening you were involved in some sort of a car accident, and you went into a coma. It's a reversible coma, and you're going to be in that coma for months, if not years. In the process of being in that coma, fortunately, your brain is repairing itself. Eventually, you're going to come out of that coma. When you do, you're not going to have any memories. You're not going to know how to read or write or speak. You're going to have to be taught to do all of those things. Do I have a right to kill you while you're in that coma? Go.
Not necessarily, but I feel like the family is always going to reserve the right if they're not sure, because they're not always sure if someone's going to come out of it. And from what I know of previous court cases, people aren't able to sue for the time that they've lost in a coma. So I don't know how you can say that an unborn child has any rights to a potential life more than the mother would have to determine whether or not that life is going to be realized.
I respect your opinion, but let me answer the question. I don't have a right to kill you. Absolutely not. Because you're valuable. Because you still have your basic human nature. And guess what? I just described accurately the condition of the unborn. When they are born, they'll develop all of those things. And they'll have to be taught to do it. But they're just as valuable as you. And just as I shouldn't kill you, I shouldn't kill them either. That's my answer.
Dr. Strossen? Thank you guys, and thank you audience for fantastic questions. We will now end with short 5-minute closing statements from each speaker, and then we will let you go. Who started?
I went first.
Yeah.
So that means I go last, or I go now?
Yeah.
I'd appreciate if the timekeeper can you hold up 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1? Thank you so much. I've got a lot to say, but I will try to confine myself to 4 brief points. First of all, I want to again thank the organizers and the audience and Michael for the opportunity to have a mutually respectful debate and discussion with important points of fundamental, I think, irreconcilable disagreement, but a lot of common ground, which I think is really important here. And I have to say, if I shared, I really respect Michael, if I shared his view about the nature of humanity, I would absolutely be there on the hustings with him, making exactly the same arguments he does. I would like to quote the Religious Coalition for Abortion Rights, which says, "We call for increased dialogue and respectful listening with those who disagree with us. With them, we share the vision of a world where all children are loved and wanted." So I think that's something that we've shared a respectful agreement and disagreement, and I would really like to emphasize the shared goals. Secondly, the second point I want to make briefly is one of the, to me, really interesting briefs before the Supreme Court from religious experts, theologians, and ethicists points out that there is a religious belief in individual religious liberty and freedom of conscience that the major faith traditions share, and therefore a reason to respect different religious beliefs about when life begins and when abortion is moral, as a moral option. Third common ground, which I already talked about, but I think it is really important that we do everything we can to spread information about contraception, to spread access to affordable contraception, especially for the most marginalized and vulnerable women, including young women and poor women, which unfortunately in our society are disproportionately women of color. And second, that we continue, and I really value what Mike says about the ministry. In my view, it should also be government, social services to facilitate families and parents in raising and educating and providing resources for children. We do not do that enough. And my fourth point, which I have 2 whole minutes to make, is that whatever your views are on this topic, I hope that you will raise your voices and contribute to not only intellectual discussion, but to policy debates. I have seen in my lifetime fervent pro-choice advocates really make a difference in bringing about safe and legal abortion for women to respect their life, their choice, and their families. I have also seen fervent pro-life activists enact legislation and restrictions that I personally disagree with. But I just want to say, whatever your views are, you have a real opportunity to enact them into public policy. And as somebody who believes in democracy, government by we the people, I want you, even as young people, the students in the audience, to realize the power that you have and to exercise it. In that spirit, I'd like to end by quoting my favorite ACLU t-shirt. Now, we all know from watching movies and TV that you have the right to remain silent, right? But this t-shirt reminds us of another right that is even more valuable, even though it is not talked about as much. And that is, you have the right not to remain silent. So please raise your voices, let the discussion and the advocacy continue. Thank you so much.
Nadine, amen on the issue of us extending grace and compassion and indeed assistance to women who are poor and who face tragic circumstances. This evening, I would simply like to, in my closing statements, revisit a couple of points and just brush up on a couple of points. First of all, I think it is very important for us to revisit the quotation that Nadine offered up earlier in her remarks from Planned Parenthood versus Casey in 1992. That statement said that at the heart of liberty is the ability to define one's own meaning of life, the meaning of the universe, and of existence. I believe that that is a dangerous position because it means that women can define the unborn out of existence simply because they get in their way. What is to stop the future Supreme Court from saying that men can define women out of existence? It is dangerous, it is tragic, and as a matter of fact, it turns the Declaration of Independence on its head. The Declaration of Independence says that we are endowed by our Creator with life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Life comes first, liberty comes second. And if you change the order of the two, no one is safe, ladies and gentlemen. If you want to understand the essential difference, though we have some commonalities, we have huge differences on this issue. And if you want to understand the difference between our two positions, it all boils down to the stop sign problem. I recognize that if you were riding with me in my car and suddenly you went into cardiac arrest, I would have to run a stop sign and do something I wouldn't normally do. I would have to run a stop sign in order to get you to the hospital in order to save your life. But you see, by defending Roe versus Wade, Nadine is defending a position where there are no stop signs whatsoever. And I believe such a society is dangerous for each and every single one of us. I revisit the thesis that I brought forth this evening. I said that I was going to demonstrate that the unborn are distinct, living, and whole human beings, actively involved in the process of developing themselves from within, from the earliest stages of their development. I did that. I relied upon the science of embryology to do that. And furthermore, I showed that there is no essential difference between the adult you are today and the unborn child you once were that would have justified killing you at that earlier stage of development. I do not believe that Nadine has given us a good reason. And for that reason, I believe the position that I have articulated wins. And if you came here espousing a different view, I believe in the name of intellectual honesty, you are obligated to change your mind. Thank you, and God bless you all.
Thank you very much, speakers. And audience, thank you very much for coming. We hope you'll come again. We have another debate on February 25th. We're at 7 p.m. We're unsure of the location, but it's between at Milan Hall, between OSU's Dr. Susan Shaw and Westminster Presbyterian Church's Dr. Martin Emmerich on the topic of gender, sexuality, and human flourishing. Specific topics to be determined. If you're interested in signing up and to hear more about what the Socratic Club does and when we have debates, you can sign up in the back on the email list, and you'll receive emails periodically, or find us on Facebook. And you can also join on the same email list if you're interested in helping us to set up wonderful discussions and debates like we just saw. You can sign up on the back or find any Socratic Club member like myself. Can we get one more round of applause for our fantastic